guys ready? All right, last 45 minutes of the day, you guys, we got this. Okay, so first question. Suzette, you kind of left this off really nicely. Just talking a little bit more about GLIS and just the progress that has been made towards establishing a harmonized definition for assessing the diagnosis of sarcopenia and just some of the challenges that might be associated with getting to that harmonized definition.
Come on.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yes, so GLIS, it's new, right? So they've been working on it since 20. Roger, you're part of it.
It's probably been about 5 years.
Okay. Yeah. Right, relatively new. And I think they are making progress. It's a little different approach because they are also looking for a consensus, right? So, there are lots of groups that put forth definitions. Many of them are data driven. Some of them have been consensus. And I think eventually we have to get to a consensus. It might not be 100%, but we have to get somewhere. So, everyone globally is then using the same definition. You're looking at the same outcomes when you're doing your trial. And hopefully you get to the same cut points, even though they may vary based on populations now. They talk about different populations having different cut points for strength or muscle.
So yeah, and Giulia actually has done a very nice analysis of this. But if you look at the sort of the prevailing consensus definitions of sarcopenia, if you look at the definitions for muscle weakness by hand grip strength, they're actually remarkably similar. They don't differ that much. So I think there's consensus there, and there's very good consensus that if you walk below 0.8 meters per second, that's a problem. That's very slow. So I think we agree on that. I think a lot of the discussion is now around what is that it's important to measure muscle mass, but then what is the most accurate way to measure muscle mass that really sort of gives you information that helps predict bad outcomes. DEXA measures lean mass and may be responsive to interventions and change in an appropriate way that it could be a proxy for changes in muscle mass, either positive or negative, but it measures other things besides muscle. And it doesn't seem to be very predictive of bad outcomes. So DEXA has been widely utilized in clinical trials and in large epidemiological cohort studies. So we have data, but it sort of has been problematic when we've tried to relate it to mortality, fractures, things like that. So I think there's a lot of discussion about that. Some people are still very tied to using DEXA and measuring lean mass, and other people are sort of more open to sort of thinking about more direct measures of muscle.
Thank you. I think we have a few questions in the audience.
Roger, maybe a follow-up to some of what you were talking about, open to all the panelists, and thank you for your presentations. One of the things I wonder about sarcopenia is, do we almost do a disservice to interventions or treatment because of the over-focus on muscle mass and strength? Meaning, as many of you touched on, there's a lot of other factors that ultimately will lead to that, right? Changes in neuromuscular junction, changes in blood flow, changes in bone, changes in ligaments, tendons. So just curious in terms of how do we do a better job of, I guess, predicting and intervening sooner, and where?
Do you agree with that? I think a lot of the definition and a lot of the area has been driven by some of the early clinical trials with the steroidal SARMs that showed that if you can induce robust increases in lean mass and in muscle mass, you get robust increases in strength and you get robust increases in performance or physical function. But that doesn't hold true if the improvements in mass are more modest. So people have been very muscle focused. Now with the idea that there potentially, as you mentioned, other targetable pathways in muscle that could improve performance, muscle performance and physical performance, I think the emphasis could come away a little bit from muscle mass. And it takes, energetically, it takes a lot of energy to make muscle. So that's a hard thing to do, right? Whereas if you give a small molecule that can increase calcium, intracellular calcium sensitivity, and you get more force for a given amount of contractile machinery, maybe that's a much more efficient way to do it. I'm not saying you can do that, but if you could do that, that would be a much more efficient way to increase muscle force and potentially increase physical functioning, walking speed, chairs. And I think the regulators have told us that you have to be able to show some clinically meaning improvement in how the patient functions. Increasing muscle mass or muscle strength will not be sufficient, at least in the drug space.
Thank you for a wonderful set of presentations. Two questions. The first is, with ICD-10, does that apply to physical therapy? Can it be used? Because it seems to me that a lot of people could benefit from.
It can be used by anybody that's billing.
Okay.
Whether it's,
Bad answer.
any provider can code, right? It's not being used very much now. Best we can tell.
Thank you. The other question is, are there any screening tools that are pretty good for getting it at sarcopenia in the community? Because what I've been hearing is stuff that you do in a clinic, a hospital, or the HNRC on aging at Tufts. But what can you do out in Roxbury and, Dorchester and places like that, where if you tried some of this other stuff that people would fall and break their hip and that'd be the end of it?
So I think that's a good question. And right now the USOP or the European Working Group on Sarcopenia has a pre-screening questionnaire. It's called SARC-F, and it looks at strength. It looks at, stair climbing, ambulation, climbing stairs, and falls. So it asks you these 5 questions, and then you're able to report it. And so I think if it's 2 or more that you have, then you would be defined as pre-sarcopenic, and then you could kind of fall down this nice flow chart that they actually have that they use to prescribe.
Yeah, and we believe that actually that would be really useful if it became standard of care. If someone over the age of 65 goes to a physician, it takes 2 minutes to fill out, and that can just say that you are at risk of sarcopenia. It's not telling you have sarcopenia, but you're at risk, and you need to start exercising. You need to start eating more protein. You need to start doing these changes in your lifestyle to help you. And we think that should be really easy, but the question is how do we get that to implement? We've been working with societies in Europe to start to integrate that into their screening programs, but it's not something consistently done, so I think there's just a lot more that we need to do to track that. But it's a really easy questionnaire to use.
You've talked a good bit about treatment and intervention. What about prevention? What can we do early on to encourage young people to develop exercise programs, health programs, so that we can prevent this?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and one that probably everyone asks themselves is how do you get people to engage in resistance training and healthy lifestyles early on? And I think it's through health promotion. I think it starts with us potentially having the evidence and then bridging that gap into practice through research, through industry, through potentially policy. But it's in getting younger folks or people even in your 5th decade of life, so your 40s, to start to engage in exercise. And I think that we try and just, we have
research papers and we show people, the evidence is good, but I think there needs to be a next step. So disseminating that knowledge in different platforms. So I think we saw from some other folks who were doing social media posts and content and all that to try and get younger people to also understand the importance of these preventative measures or preventative interventions.
Is this even talked about in medical school?
Well, they don't teach much of nutrition in medical school, so,
I think the best you can hope for is that your provider at least asks you if you are exercising or being physically active. But I don't know what they say if you tell them, no, I don't. I hate to exercise. I think they probably tell you that you should, but
I want to go back to the middle school and high
Yeah,
school kids and convince them
Yeah.
to develop this early on.
And I was in, one of the Tony parts of Boston Sunday morning with my wife. We had gone to our, group exercise, our boot camp class. And, I just commented, I said, everybody's either running or, exercising. We're on Newbury Street. There's a lot of active people in the morning. And if you looked at that picture, you would think, gee, this culture of young people has embraced physical activity. But it's so driven by educational and socioeconomic status. These are all high income, highly educated people you see this in, and it's not universally adopted. So I think, that's another issue that we have to always kind of consider here. And, it's a really serious issue, I think.
Go ahead, Connie.
So I have a couple of questions and they're related a little bit, I think. First is, I've heard others present the data you presented about how if you walk faster, it's associated with a longer life. And I've been thinking lately, and I think maybe you presented it an opposite way. It's probably not that if you force yourself to start walking faster, you're going to live longer. It's that when you slow down, it's because of all those other confounding reasons that you can't walk as much. And so prevention is really key. But let's get into environment now and cultural attitude. So I spent a week on the southern coast of Italy last summer and was reminded there's no accommodations for disability. There were steps everywhere all the time. And maybe we have enabled immobility because either the elderly are hiding somewhere or they never lost the ability to walk stairs. And so now I moved fairly recently to San Diego. And what do people tell you? They say, get a ranch style house because you're getting older and whatnot. And I'm thinking, well, first of all, you can't find a ranch style house in San Diego. But I'm thinking, this is the very time I ought to be having stairs to keep mobile. And that's not what everybody's saying, is we need that cultural and that environment to keep mobile.
The thing about the stairs and safety issues about stairs is that, depends on where you are in the spectrum of aging and your mobility status, right? So for people that are, well, that's right. I think just like with everything in this sort of aging, 60 to 70-year-olds now, I think, you thought 10 years ago, 60, 70-year-olds, no one had a cell phone, no one had a computer. Now this is all kind of changing, right? So I think the culture of this aging group is going to be a little different than it was 10, 20 years ago, I think.
I'm still hearing.
Yeah, well, it's hard to change, opinion, but I think there's at least an awareness that being more mobile is better for you than trying not to do anything sort of static.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, with all the education that everyone has been doing, right, there is awareness among physicians because I met a group of physicians and generally they would never talk about sarcopenia. And they would tell me, did you know by the age of 50, you start to lose muscle? And I said, wow, that's the message we've been talking about. So it got to some people, right? So I think the more we talk about it, the more we go on media, what the task force is trying to do now, right? Engage more community, more public affairs into it. the more it becomes relevant to people and people realize that aging is not supposed to be a certain way, right? You're not supposed to be slow and falling down, falling over and having falls. You can prevent that, but you need to start doing something about it. I think there's a positive force that's coming. At least I'm very optimistic because just, talking to people, they've heard the word sarcopenia, which to me is amazing because people did not know about sarcopenia 5 years ago.
I think we have a question in the back, yeah.
Yeah, so it's actually a follow-up point on what was just raised before too, actually. One is both related to prevention. One is that, at least for those who have health insurance plans, most of them actually provide fitness benefits of some sort. And it would be really interesting. I don't know how many of the people who are insured actually use it. So when we think about prevention, that's something that the health insurance industry is recognized, but how much of that's actually implemented in practice? So when we think about trying to get people across the lifespan to get them moving more, financial incentivization is always a plus. So that's one thing I think is worth considering, especially in the context of sarcopenia. And then the other point that I think a lot of you were alluding to, don't underestimate the built environment, and there's subtle ways in which you can improve upon the built environment to make these types of changes besides the ranch house thing I totally get. That certainly is one, but even subtle things like trying to encourage people to not park right at the best spot when they go to a store. If you're working if you're still working and you work on the third floor, arrows define the stairs to go up and down, not just down. So there's a lot of ways that you can make subtle improvements on a public health level that can actually have a quite profound impact in terms of things like sarcopenia and other things related to aging.
Even the fact that stairs in newer buildings are sort of more featured architecture than they used to be. They're not kind of closed off.
Yeah.
So you can walk the stairs in like a nice space. And all those things to make a difference. It's very good.
Okay, while we're waiting to get April a microphone, just another quick question. So we talked a lot about just like treatments and nutrition, lifestyle interventions, but if you guys could just touch on a little bit about the difference between treatments and prevention, right? Are there differences? What are they?
Okay, I can take a go at this. So when we talk about treatments, right? With sarcopenia, there's a progression, right? One person could be at an early stage of sarcopenia, and one person should be, they were classifying it as severe sarcopenia, right? So they have deficits in all three components, mass, strength, as well as physical function. And I think that's important because when we talk about treatments, right? When we talk about exercise and nutrition, maybe those work for people who are at early stage sarcopenia to prevent the progression into a late stage. But what we don't know is if someone is really declined to a certain level, will exercise and nutrition bring them back? I don't think there's enough data. Maybe that's the space where pharmaceuticals could play in. And I think some of the pharma companies are specifically looking at populations that have these real deficits to show an improvement. In terms of prevention, early stage, of course, we all talked about, just get people to run or just do some kind of exercise, just to keep them moving. And I should bring in protein, and that's also a topic for you, because we know that protein is really important, of course, substrate for muscle, but people are not consuming as much protein as they should. We've done analysis of enhanced data and found that people over the age of 65, around 50% were not getting even the RDA, 0.8 grams per kg body weight of protein. So if you're not even eating your basic requirement of protein, it's really hard to maintain your muscle, right? Especially once you're aging. So just the awareness of improving your diet, the quality of your diet, the quantity of the macros in your diet, and which ones to focus on, because our diets tend to be carb heavy for some reason, because they're fun and just more getting people to be intentional about reading labels and trying to choose foods that provide them with a high protein.
Great. And I think April, you have a question.
Just
Oh,
say-
yeah,
say
of
one
course.
thing
Go
then.
ahead. Sure.
So I also think that, when we're talking about treatment of sarcopenia and sarcopenia in general, we're so focused on loss of mass, loss of strength, targeting poor physical functioning, at least I am. Muscle has a lot of other very important metabolic and physiological goals, right? It's really important for maintaining a resting energy, your resting energy expenditure. All the sort of, role it has in insulin action and insulin sensitivity, tremendously important. And so I think, both with diet, physical activity, lifestyle interventions, anything you can do to sort of improve your muscle quality and prevent whatever muscle loss you're having, I think has overall benefits beyond just the sort of preventing loss of strength, preventing loss of physical function. I think when we're thinking about sarcopenia, it's very targeted, I think, on this really sort of fundamental role that muscle has in mobility. But again, muscle has lots of other important metabolic and physiologic roles that are really important to preserve. Plus the amino acid reserves for trauma, injury, illness, right? That we want to have.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. Suzette, you answered part of my question because I really wanted to dive into the nutrition and the diet also. And with Giulia, you put in your presentation as your recommendation was resistance training, and healthy diet. So I wanted to know more about the healthy diet. So we hear about the protein, where there's certain types of protein. There's so much other, research and things out there, possibly like with vitamin D, antioxidants. How about some bioactives? Like, what are some other things outside of the protein? And then also the types of proteins for sarcopenia, either to prevent sarcopenia or once you have sarcopenia to help with, treating. So prevention and treating. I know it's a kind of a lot mixed in there, but just dive a little more into nutrition and the diet.
I can take a first go. So I think, like you mentioned, some of the focus of our work has been around protein supplementation, but I think that what I like to start with first is that a healthy diet approach. So you want to have a food first approach before supplementing with anything. And so I would say, having just like that balanced plate. I think here it's called My Plate. In Canada, we've got Canada's Food Guide. So just making sure that you have all those nutrients. Those are great. And some of the other muscle health nutrients that we've seen and talked about sometimes are omega-3s as well as vitamin D. But protein recommendations for older adults, actually. So the RDA is at 0.8, but the ProTage, so the protein and aging group, recommends about 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight to about 1.6 for older adults. And so that can be very difficult to consume regularly, right? It's a lot of food. So that's when supplementation can come in and help on top of that regular diet. So I'd always encourage food first and then adding that supplementation to meet those recommendations. And then for protein, I think to be effective too, when we're supplementing, it has to usually come along with exercise. So I would say that exercise is like, I don't love this term, but like is the king, and then the protein supplementation is the queen, or like the cherry on top of the cake. That one's better. So it helps, but I think resistance training is the most important, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree, but I'll add on that if someone is malnourished, right, that they're in this problem because you don't have enough substrate, you don't have enough calories, you don't have enough to build. And even if you try to exercise, if you don't have those substrates, you're not going to make it. So, nutrition status is really important. Identifying risk of malnutrition. There are easy questionnaires that are out there to identify if someone is at risk. And especially when people are over 65 years, they tend to eat less. So all that contributes to a risk of malnutrition. So I think that's really important. A point to keep in mind, right? Are you getting what you need to be well nourished? Then exercise, and then supplement with more protein if you need.
This is kind of a vicious cycle because Sue Roberts did a really nice review about this 5 or 6 years ago now. You know, if you have a baseline energy requirement of under 1,500 calories, like a 75, 80-year-old woman, you know, because they have very low lean mass, low total energy requirements, very difficult to eat an adequate amount of micronutrients. So, you know, this contributes to this sort of syndrome of malnutrition, especially for these specific micronutrients. So unless you think about supplementing, it's very hard to do this. So it's another role muscle has, I think, indirectly that's really important.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, actually. The first I'm going to direct towards Roger, but anybody can answer. I noticed that in the walking speed decline in age, so it's clear that walking faster was beneficial, but the range of decline was much greater in those people that walked fast than it was in the other groups. And is there anything meaningful in that?
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, I'm not sure. They may be younger, and the older age groups, the sort of distribution of the sort of their walking speeds is maybe a little bit tighter. So I'm not sure. I don't know.
Yeah, because it was like, whoa, that declines a much steeper in that.
And this, remember, this is, you know, these are 8 or 10 different epi cohorts, but basically the distance walked varies a little bit. You know, sometimes it's 4 or 6 meters, but the instructions are always the same. The participants are instructed to walk at their usual pace. So this isn't as fast as they can walk or any other. It's, you know, walk along this path at your usual walking pace. But I don't know. I don't know whether that's meaningful. I just don't know.
Thank you. And then the second question is, I think that my legs are probably the larger muscle group, but so does that mean walking, you know, when we talk about resistance training and working to maintain muscle mass, is walking really, really an important one, or are there other recommendations in terms of muscles that I should focus on?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, you know, if you look at the guidelines, like the physical activity guidelines for older adults, for all Americans, and there's some specific guidelines for older adults, they talk about, you know, 1 to 2 days per week of resistance training, focusing on the large muscle groups of the upper and lower extremity. And I think that's basically just because, you know, people perform tasks with their lower extremities and their upper extremities, but you're right. If you want to preserve walking functions, you know, your lower extremities are really important for that. But the public health recommendations are, you know, all large muscle groups to the extent that you can. I thought you were going to ask why grip strength, but.
Thank you guys for all the questions too. I think Sharon, yeah, go ahead.
So my question is the link between osteoporosis and sarcopenia, and is that similar with men as it is with women? And
yeah, except the reverse to the onset of clinically meaningful loss of bone density occurs earlier in women. It occurs in men, but it occurs in later ages. So you see the osteoporosis in men in their 80s. And the biological mechanisms that drive it are remarkably similar. Some of the environmental factors are similar, not all of them, but many of them.
Seems like a great opportunity for communication, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And even, you know, in being on too many of these consensus groups around sarcopenia, you know, we have looked to the, you know, if you go back 30 years ago, there's a lot of disagreement about whether osteoporosis was even a disease or not. Some people said that loss of bone density was just sort of a natural consequence of aging. It didn't really matter for anything. And, Steve Cummings and all the sort of leaders in the bone field sort of got together. They really tried to develop a sort of objective definition of osteoporosis, and learning from them has been helpful in thinking about how, not that as far along as they are, but has helped us sort of think about how to define this syndrome.
So I also have a question about hormone replacement therapy. And I think initially after Women's Health Initiative data, there was really this idea of not providing estrogen therapy. And I'm not a clinician or a toxicologist. So I think, do you see, I'm starting to see more women continuing on hormone therapy postmenopausally. And I'm wondering if that might help in terms of some of this, because your osteoporosis is probably affecting your mobility as well.
So there are estrogen receptors in muscle, and there's also conversion of estradiol to testosterone. So probably there is some beneficial effect, and there does seem to be sort of an accelerated loss of muscle postmenopausally. So yes, probably there's effects on muscle with hormone replacement therapy as well. I don't know if there's been good studies done on that, but that's not right my area per se.
All right, go ahead, Eric.
Thanks everyone, that was really great. I'm just curious, as I listen to you, it sounds like this field, and I'll also say full disclosure, I was the person that was shocked to hear that no one had heard of sarcopenia that Roger mentioned. Sorry about that. But it does sound like, for someone who's uninitiated, the field's kind of far along, right? You've got 2 interventions that sound pretty effective and safe, right? And protein and resistance training. You've got some easy diagnostic criteria, that survey that you had mentioned. Maybe there's some discussion on what the specific more technical criteria is for that. You've got a public health recommendation that Roger just mentioned. So where do you see as the major gap? Because from the outside, it seems like you've got all the kind of big boxes checked. So where do you see, from your perspective, what does the field need in order to gain more acceptance or understanding or awareness?
So there are no clinically approved therapeutic interventions for sarcopenia. So no, a successfully designed and agreed upon phase 3 trial of a biologic or a small molecule that showed a clinically meaningful improvement in one of these outcomes we talked about, and FDA regulatory approval of an indication would really do a lot. Not just for that drug, but it would do a lot for the field, because whatever operational definition that phase 3 study used to get approval would then be the de facto definition of sarcopenia that we would have for a while that we would use. So that would be tremendously important for the field, not just for pharmacologic interventions, but for the field in general. So there are some there's some potential phase 3s that may happen, but they haven't happened yet.
I also think that we don't have very good, accurate, feasible measures of muscle mass. So the gold standard would be an MRI, and of course that's really difficult to administer feasibly. So we use proxy measures like DEXA, BIA. We now have one called D3 creatine that Roger mentioned earlier, which has shown to be pretty good so far. So that might be useful because it's a small pill that you would take and it's just a urine sample. So a little bit more feasible. But I think not having a good measure of muscle mass makes it a little bit difficult too, because then we've started to move away from the inclusion of that. And I think some of the disagreement comes from the fact that sarcopenia originated as like the definition was muscle, and then the accompanying decline in strength. So I think maybe that's kind of my perception on why we've also had some difficulty, because we can't decide what are the components in it. And then with that comes all those consensus groups that have various different cutoff points too. So with each like muscle mass, grip strength, and then function, we have a bunch of different tools, and they all have different cut points that different definitions use. So I think there's just a lot in the literature, and I think we're just trying to figure out, really distill what are the key aspects and which key tools are we going to use that are feasible for both researchers and clinicians, and then what those cut points look at. Because as one of the slides that I showed is like that cut point too makes a huge difference in determining if someone is pre-sarcopenic, sarcopenic, like at risk, or if they have it. So I think that's an important consideration, as well as like where are we going to draw that cutoff.
And to add on to that, if we're thinking globally, right, we need tools that are affordable. You cannot expect the emerging markets to do imaging, or even the D3, which is pretty expensive analysis, right? So we really need something that's user-friendly, that's affordable, that can be used globally for people to be able to diagnose. If they screen, maybe that's enough. Maybe that's just the first step to say you have a problem and do this, right? And now in this digital age, I know that there are more and more little companies trying to develop digital tools to measure grip strength and walking speed. Maybe that's to come, and that's, if someone can do it in their home and know that they are at risk of something, I think that's even more valuable, because then they are engaged in trying to fix their life. So I think, with this digital era, we might be getting tools that are going to help enhance awareness of sarcopenia, and then, whether we get diagnosed or not, I don't know, that would be great if you can, but maybe we are not there yet. But at least identifying that someone is at risk is good enough to get us a few steps forward.
Okay, I have another question. So a hot topic right now are these GLP-1 drugs, these weight loss drugs. I had to ask it. But if you guys could just touch a little bit on, the research that's out there with these drugs and with sarcopenia and muscle loss, and if it's something we should really be looking out for, or is it just truly fear mongering?
So I've been at a couple of conferences that have been talking about this. So regardless of what GLP-1 agonists you use, the data is pretty clear that between 25 and 40% of the weight that is lost is lean mass by DEXA. And it's likely that a component of that lean mass loss is muscle. But on the other hand, very few of the phase 3 trials that have been done on these agonists have included very many older adults in them. There have been some, but not very many. If you look at the self-reported quality of life, it has gone up dramatically. These patients feel dramatically better, so their quality of life improves a lot. There's a little bit of data on muscle strength in general. Strength, absolute strength goes down in the studies that have looked at that. But if you look at strength relative to the person's body weight, it doesn't change. So we don't know if this is a problem. The other thing to remember is that, and it looks very similar to what happens when people lose weight with a lifestyle intervention, except the degree of weight loss with a lifestyle intervention is 8 to 10% of their weight loss if they're lucky, right? These folks lose 20% of their body weight. And if they stay on the drugs, they keep it off, or they may continue to lose weight. I think that there could be a concern in older adults that are given these therapies that are starting at a lower muscle mass, but we don't have any data on that yet. It will be really interesting to understand what happens. There's also a lot of contention about what the composition of the weight regain is when you go off your GLP-1 therapy. There's some people that are concerned that the composition of weight regain is largely fat mass, not as much regain of lean mass, and could that also compromise many people, and in particular older people? But I don't think we really know very much more than that.
I agree, Roger. There needs to be more data as they come along. One area that we have been interested in is how is their nutritional status changing, because they stop eating. You just don't have an urge or need to eat. And that comes as a price sometimes, because you're not going to get the essential nutrients that you need. But there isn't enough data out there to show, long-term effects of these drugs on your nutritional status. And maybe if people are aware that, they need to be very specific and eat right things to help your muscle, maybe it will be a better outcome, but we don't know. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be.
For coming, Joanna.
Well, shame on the drug companies for not doing the research before putting these things out. It's ridiculous how little data there is. But besides that, with older people, if they're on Social Security, I don't think we're going to need to worry, because nobody could afford the drugs who was just on Social Security alone for very long. And what's happening, I think, with a lot of patients is that they're on it for a while and they're putting in money, their own money, to lose the weight. And then they start tapering or they start doing this back and forth. And the question is, are there any interventions that help them once they've taken the deep dive, lost some weight, to keep that weight off and also to taper off the drugs? Because the drugs, unless they suddenly become reasonable, are always going to be too expensive for most people on Social Security.
Well, from the weight loss registry trials, right, the things that keep, the people that keep their weight off when they lose them through lifestyle interventions, the people that weigh themselves every day and are more physically active. So and nobody's done this, but I'm sure physical activity could help prevent some of the weight regain in those settings, and probably could also preserve some of the lean mass, prevent some of the lean mass and muscle mass loss that occurs when you're on therapy. And then the other thing, I know the cost is prohibitive, but the cost will come down. And then there are also oral GLP-1s being developed that'll be less expensive to prescribe. So I don't think the cost is going to keep people away from that ultimately.
All right, I think we're just about time. So if you guys, one last question, if you guys just want to summarize just a little bit, just where we're going, you know, the future of sarcopenia and how we're really going to get this adopted as an ICD code, and would love to hear from one of you or all.
No, I think we just have to beat the bushes and really go to people and providers and patients that we don't normally talk to, right? This is not about going to the ASN meeting. It's not about going to the American Geriatric Society meeting. It's going to meetings of emergency room docs and physician assistants and maybe even physical therapists that remarkably don't know very much about this sometimes. I think that's where we have to kind of devote our resources to those groups that we don't talk to and don't hear from us now. We have to go sort of to them.
Drive safe.
Okay.
And on that, no, let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you all so much for a great discussion, and thank you to our audience. I know it's the last session of the day, but just for being so engaging and asking a lot of questions. Also, let's do one round of applause to everyone who spoke today. It was very interesting. It was great presentations. So this concludes our program today. If you missed anything, the videos will be recorded and posted on our website in the coming weeks. Tomorrow we are starting at 9 a.m. sharp.